Good morning and welcome to our bright blue Ludgate lectures, named after Ludgate Circus. Ludgate Circus is where the bright blue offices are, and I'm delighted to say that they're occupied again now. Bright Blue is an independent think tank which promotes liberal conservatism, and I'm Sarah Sands, chair of Bright Blue. These lectures introduced this year invite prominent public figures and thinkers to discuss the great issues of our time. So I'm delighted to welcome today the former Prime Minister of Australia, the Right Honourable Julia Gillard, to talk about qualities of leadership. Julia currently serves as the Chairwoman of the Global Partnership for Education, so I hope we can talk a bit about that and the effect of the pandemic on education. And she's also just taken over as Chair of the Wellcome Trust, so we'll be seeing more of her in Britain, I'm very pleased to say. The pandemic has required outstanding leadership, both national and global. So I'd like to invite Julia to talk to us about the nature and the gender of that leadership. Then I'll follow up with a few questions and open the floor to more. So we have an hour in all. If you could submit questions through Slido, and we'll be live tweeting the event using the hashtag female leadership. So Julia, opening remarks from you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for this opportunity. I want to talk about leadership today predominantly through the prism of gender, reflecting my work at the Global Partnership for Education and also the fact that I chair the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at King's College London. Starting firstly with the Global Partnership for Education, we can't sensibly talk about equality in leadership, including gender equality, unless every child around the world gets an opportunity, particularly an opportunity for a high quality education. And that's what the Global Partnership for Education exists to do. It is the multilateral fund that works with developing countries around the world to improve the quality of and access to school education. And this is of particular importance right now here in the UK, because the government of the UK, in partnership with the government of Kenya, is leading the replenishment campaign for the Global Partnership for Education, reflecting Prime Minister Johnson's commitment to girls' education. So I expect girls' education to be a big theme of the G7, which the UK is leading. And of course, Sarah, you know all about that. And then in July, the UK, we will be, we hope, profoundly raising its hand for education with a substantial pledge of its own towards the work of educating every child, particularly every girl, through the Global Partnership for Education, and through making a substantial pledge itself, leading the way so that other nations also come to the fore and make a major contribution to change. So this is the right moment for anybody who is involved, wants to be involved in that advocacy, to get right in and to raise their hand for education. The UK government is in decision-making mode now about the nature of the contribution to the Global Partnership for Education. When we broaden the lens from education and say, what are we thinking about in terms of leadership in our world? Many of the people watching today would have seen that constantly in the press, we've got articles saying that women have led better during COVID. Now, the evidence, I think, is a little hard to get to grips with on this, partly because the statistician in me wants to say we don't have enough women leaders to actually have a credible statistical base for all of these conclusions. And I'm also very cautious about baking the sexism in by saying that there is a distinctive style of male leadership and a distinctive style of female leadership. I don't think that's true. Men and women's brains are the same, but we are socialised differently. And the way in which we receive leadership, the way in which we see leaders is through our own culture and our own acclimatisation around gender norms. And so we are most likely as voters to respond positively to women leaders if we believe that they combine strength and empathy, that they've got the backbone to get us through, but that they haven't given up on all of the stereotypical female traits, including empathy, kindness, and nurturing. And I do think that at this time in the world's history, people have responded well to leaders who have combined those two things. Or put another way, the style of leadership that has most got into difficulties during this time is the hyper macho style of leadership shown, for example, by President Bolsonaro in Brazil, where expert advice has simply been dismissed with a wave of the hand. And whilst you can swagger your way through many political crises, your swagger doesn't count in the face of a virus that just gets on and does what it's going to do, infecting human beings. So I think there are some things we can learn out of this time about the future of leadership. There are also some things we can learn about how to rebuild with gender baked into the COVID recovery. And very quickly, I think what that includes is a better valuing of caring work in the future. It's one thing to get out and clap for the NHS. It's another thing for societies around the world to say that they will better value their caring workforces, which are predominantly women. As we rebuild economies, there needs to be a recognition that the jobs predominantly lost during COVID have been in female-dominated industries. So the traditional economic tools for the rebuild need to be rethought. Third, we could be entering an era of better gender dynamics in many workplaces. Of course, many jobs need to be done in person, but the technology we're using now does enable us to remake work in many workplaces in a more gender inclusive and friendly way if we are intentional about it. And then I think there are some issues on the home front. We know that domestic labour is maldistributed, with women doing more of it and women stepping up disproportionately to the extra burdens during lockdowns, including homeschooling. And we know, unfortunately, that home is not a safe place for many women. And so I think having a community dialogue about that domestic front and change also matters as we seek to move forward and to build back better. So there's some of the issues on my mind. Sarah, I'm very happy to have a conversation with you and then to take questions.
Well, thank you very much for that. You've laid it out brilliantly, and it is something that we've been thinking about, whether there is something sort of female about this whole sort of pandemic and perhaps therefore the way out of it. You know, I notice even talking to sort of vaccinologists that they made the point that there's something about public health which has a kind of female associations, you know, that it's about the sort of broader good. It's not a particularly swaggering field of medicine normally, you know, it's not the great sort of surgery or something. It's and yet, you know, that sort of patient distribution of just caring for the greatest possible amount of people seem to be something that chimed with women. But you're also right. It's an interesting point that that women have both been at the forefront, but you know they've also taken the big hit, haven't they? You know, on jobs. And some people have suggested that, you know, it's been a big step back for women. And one thing I was interested in your book on women and leadership was that the idea of women leaders, you know, being the norm or being a kind of aberration. You know, you can step back in the way that if we're seeing women generally sort of losing jobs, and taking up too much of a burden of the domestically, which means that they just in the end can't do both, that they're, you know, they're have one hand tied behind their back in that way. So that there seems sort of two parts of that. One, to ask you of the sort of state of female leadership, you know, around the world, and whether that concerns you. You know, looking at G7, there are very few women amongst those leaders, and whether you think we're going backwards in that way. That's the sort of first question. And secondly, about the role of women domestically, and whether and what we need to do to redistribute some sort of distribution with men on domestic labour, unpaid labour.
Sure. Happy to answer both. I don't think we're going backwards, but we aren't going forwards quickly enough. And I think we can get a little confused between stock and flow questions here. I think people in the moment, when they see the news from around the world, can get the impression that there are quite a few women leaders because they see Jacinda Ardern, they see Chancellor Merkel and the like, and they think to themselves, well, there seems to be a number of women leading. But when we actually look at the flow over time, we know that fully 70% of nations on Earth have never been led by a woman. And there are only 3 nations on Earth that have been led by women 3 times, New Zealand being one of them. Whereas gender equality would mean that if you looked at a nation's politics over, say a 20-year cycle, we know with the ebbs and flows of political parties coming in and out, you would be able to say to yourself, well, across that cycle, the nation has been led by a woman half of the time. And if we look, here in the UK or at the US in particular, it seems a long way from where we are now to be able to look at a flow of politics over time and not to see just the first female president, but to see women presidents so routinely that they're in office half the time. So we've got a lot to do. Another way of looking at those statistics is that the World Economic Forum tells us that we aren't going to hit political equality for around 100 years. So that's far too long to wait. These questions are correlated with structural impediments in political parties and politics generally, and in other workplaces that prevent women coming through. They're associated with stereotyping, the whispers in the back of all of our brains that tell us that some roles are more congruent for men and some roles are more congruent for women. But they are also associated with the domestic burdens that you talk about. If we are going to equalise labour force participation and access to leadership, then it does take equalising on the home front too. And there the statistics are a little bit shocking. Research during the pandemic showed, and this research was conducted in the UK, that even in households, male-female households, where both of them worked full-time and she was the highest income earner, that the woman disproportionately stepped up to the extra domestic labour required because of lockdowns and homeschooling. So, the assumption here that many people would make, which is that the, man tends to be the higher income earner and consequently it makes economic sense for the domestic burden to fall more on the labour force participant who earns less and she might be working part-time. Even when you take all of that out of the equation, it is simply gender stereotyping that is putting more domestic labour on the shoulders of women. And of course, we can change that if we choose to.
Yes, so the question is how, because you do address that a bit in your book. Firstly, what is the model for leadership, for female leadership? And I suppose, we are seeing that now. We are seeing it in New Zealand. And it is interesting that, if you have one female leader, does it make it easier to have a second? But you do talk about, public expectations about what they want from women. That actually one very interesting question that you bring up is it all right for women to cry or not? Because it has very different connotations. And I like the image you had of if men have a picture of their family in their office, they're thought to be sort of caring. If women do, you think that their mind's not on the job. But so what is that model of female leadership that we can work to that overcome some of these stereotypes, and what are the impediments? You talk about the media, something obviously I have a history in of how much it's, the media makes things much harder for women. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Sure. With my co-author Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who has now gone on to be the head of the World Trade Organization, so a very big job at a very difficult time. We did publish here and in many other places around the world our book on women and leadership last year. And the essence of it is looking at the global research base, but also interviewing 8 women leaders and seeing, does this academic research ring true in their own lives? And in many ways it did, not in all ways, but in many ways. Just on the role of the media, to give one example from Ngozi, my co-author, at the time that she took over the World Trade Organization, there was a European newspaper that headlined her appointment with the headline, 66-year-old grandmother takes over leadership of the World Trade Organization. something that wouldn't be written about a man. And of course, the appropriate headline was "World Leading Economist becomes Director General of the WTO." So, you know, gendered reporting is there everywhere. It's not just in the reporting of individual women leaders, but research at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. We use natural language processing techniques to look at, you know, at a time we will look at 150,000 articles in traditional media across 3 countries, and we will analyse, for example, who is being listened to, reported when it comes to COVID. And we will find that if the article is about domestic violence, yes, the voices are disproportionately women. But once we're in the zone of economics, politics, science, then it is well and truly male voices that you're hearing. So we do have to, you know, change the public treatment, but to have more women come through, I don't think the change agenda is about the women and the model of female leadership. It's about the structures and about us. And on the structures, I mean, are there any barriers in political parties or parliaments themselves that prevent women coming through? You know, for example, in Australia, you know, people have to fly into Canberra. It's a big country. They come from far away, got to be there for parliamentary weeks. It was during, you know, the time that I was in politics that the non-members bar got turned into a childcare centre, so women with young children could get occasional care when they were in Parliament. Of course, all of the jokes have been done since that the behaviour is much better with the kids in there than it was with people in the non-members bar, but I'll leave people to draw their own conclusions about that. Here in the UK, we've seen things like Stella Creasy fight to have a locum in her constituency when she's off on maternity leave. I mean, in every other job, there's an expectation that your position gets backfilled when you're on maternity leave. Why not in politics? So there are structural things to think about, but there are also the stereotypes in the back of our head that tell us when we look at a woman, we're more likely to judge on appearance. If she's showing leadership, we're more likely to believe in the back of our heads that she's probably unlikable. The psychological research shows that very clearly, that we're much more interested in family structures and who is caring for her kids, rather than making similar inquiries about men with young children, and the list goes on. And I think changing that is about shining a white hot spotlight on those stereotypes, because once you put them in the light, they can't survive. And, you know, we realise they're ridiculous, but when they're just, you know, baked into how we see the world, they're there influencing our views. So I think surfacing the global research, which is what we do at the Institute for Women's Leadership, really matters as part of the change agenda.
I think I'm sure that that awareness is key. There was a public health government advertisement that went on about telling people to stay at home, and it had a series of pictures of a mother and a daughter doing the ironing, doing a bit of homeschooling, doing some mopping. And then there was a picture of the father finally appeared on the sofa at the end of the day with his arm exhausted by doing we don't know what, but it is, and it was, and you know, that was picked up, and so I'm sure that awareness is certainly part of it. I think it's tremendously interesting of what you can do, what's to bring about change, what's sort of, you know, cultural, what's legislative, what's, you know, what's sort of funding or government led. But and I guess how you shine that light is whether you do that just is to do data or transparency or just getting people to understand things differently. I notice proxy voting was something that came up here, that that it was a man, I think Jacob Rees-Mogg, that said much better and truer to the traditions of Parliament to have women, to have everyone, you know, in Parliament in the evening, so that you had a better sense of a sort of collegiate sense. So to get rid of proxy voting, where one, you know, can where you can do an arrangement, and immediately a lot of women, you know, had to leave, or just felt that they couldn't continue in those careers. So sometimes it's those barriers that people haven't just thought through, and I guess it's women as an afterthought rather than women being, central. And I don't know quite how you think you sort of change that. You talk about making women, absolutely sort of integral to policies, but how do you do that?
Yeah, I think we're at the stubborn, complex stage of the problem now. I mean, on gender equality in societies like the UK, and this is also true of Australia, the more obvious things that can be done have been done. I think back to, this is going back quite some time, but to when I emerged from university into my career as a lawyer. It didn't happen to me, but it was common back then for young law graduates who were seeking article clerk positions for women to go to interviews with 5 male partners. Now, law firms today would not do that in their interviewing. So, obvious things have been changed. We've had the work of the 30% Club working on corporate boards. Many businesses have really borne down on gender equality and tried to change circumstances in their businesses. Political parties have been talking about this for some time. So we should say, yes, there has been change, but now we're in that sticky place where we've done the obvious things, but clearly we need to do more. And I think the only way of finding those things is, one, to centre the data. We need gender disaggregated data. We need to be very methodical about what is going on, where the pinch points are, where we lose women. And, for something like proxy voting, that's exactly the kind of thing where you could do a statistical run and see through a gender lens what difference proxy voting or the lack of it makes. Second, we need women's voices involved in policy design. And, there's a pernicious circle here that if we don't have enough women at the top, then unless special measures are undertaken, we won't have women's voices in policy design. To put that in a very, sort of comedic way, there was a moment during the pandemic in Australia when various restrictions were being announced. And one of the restrictions was you could go to the hairdresser, but only for a 30-minute appointment, whereupon every woman in Australia went, heavens above, who thought that was a good idea. Now, look, that's a silly comedic example, but it's meant to illuminate a broader point that if you don't have women's voices at the policy table, then, very clear gender dynamics in the eyes of women will be missed in decision making. And we can't confine ourselves to one tool. If there was a magic bullet here, we would have found it by now. There's not a magic bullet, but it requires that complex interplay of government as a policy leader, government simply using its bully pulpit to actually advocate for change, businesses feeling both internal pressure and community pressure to make changes in their own organisations, and supply chain pressure. One of the things that's happening now, which I think will be particularly effective, is that major businesses are starting to say, we won't deal with or buy from other businesses that don't equate the kind of diversity goals that we hold dear. So, all of those economic tools, will good staff come and work with you? Will they stay? Will consumers buy from you? Will other businesses deal with you? All of those things need to be brought in. We need the global lens. We're building at the Global Institute a gender index to help us compare and contrast countries' performances so we can shine a light on best practice. Yeah, and we need, as individuals, to be thinking about this, talking about this, surfacing our own stereotypes, teaching our kids to not fall for these stereotypes, to as basic as, pink is for girls, blue is for boys. We need to be, and interestingly, each of the women we talked to for the book, one thing she definitely, all of them had in common, was they came from an enabling home environment where they weren't told, these things aren't for you because you're a girl. They were told to aim high and think big. So enabling environments for children that don't bake in the gender stereotyping. So yes, many things to do, and we've got to get them working in combination.
That's fascinating. And actually, the Gender Equality Advisory Council for GEAC, which I'm chairing, has a lot of scientists in it, and I've noticed that they've made the point first about families, as you said, that they've come from homes that have encouraged them, and that just gives you such a straight advantage. But also that, you know, the concern that women may be designed out of the future. So we're talking about actual algorithms and so on, which you think somehow technology can solve all this, because algorithms will be you know, gender neutral, except that they're being designed by men unless you get more women into science and technology. And so so the bias continues, you know, because it can only reflect society. So so it is interesting, the complexity, as you say, that how it all knits together. And I've got some questions coming in now. If I can start with one that says, is misogyny deeply rooted in Australian politics? Thinking back to your speech in the House of Representatives towards Tony Abbott. Is it to Australia misogyny, or do you see it elsewhere? You did have a very, you were given a very rough time, weren't you? I think everyone agrees that.
Look, I'm always reluctant to say this is particularly an Australian problem. Obviously, I'm a very proud Australian. But there are some very profound issues in our politics that we need to resolve, and they came to the forefront when I was Prime Minister. They've been at the forefront of the political debate in Australia over the last 2 or 3 months as a result of a horrifying series of revelations about the treatment of women in Parliament House, started by the courage of a young female former ministerial staff member. So you would use the terminology special advisor here, who revealed that she had been raped in Parliament House by a more senior male staffer, and that has cascaded into a major debate around women, Parliament House, women in our society. So yes, we've got much to do in Australia, but I think people would be, sort of pointing elsewhere if they thought this was somehow an Australian problem and not a problem around the world. I mean, we spoke to 8 women leaders around the world. We spoke to Theresa May, Jacinda Ardern, Hillary Clinton, Erna Solberg from Norway, Christine Lagarde heading up, as she did then, the IMF, Joyce Banda from Malawi, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf from Liberia, Michelle Bachelet from Chile. So women from very diverse cultures and contexts, and all of them pointed to gendered experiences in their journey towards leadership and how they were treated as leaders. And so I think that's reinforcing that even in a society which people would look at like Norway, which comes up always very highly on gender equality indices, there's more to do. And that means that this is a dialogue for all of us, not just for some parts of the world.
That's interesting. We've seen that again at GEAC, that actually talking about violence against women, that there's no country that you can say is free of that. And I suppose it also starts to point up the difference between diversity and inclusion, which people are talking about more now, that you can do diversity in a sort of token way about just appointing some women, but actually to change the culture so that women can make contributions as well, and not just be brought in as an add-on, is certainly something that I think we're all looking at. So I've got some more questions now, which is, how can women learn to stop holding themselves back? Women are less likely to apply for jobs unless they meet 100% of the advertised requirements, for example.
That's a great question, and it takes us to the heart of a really important dialogue. And I think, just to make the point, I don't think these silos are quite as separate as I'm going to paint them now, but I think there are 2 perspectives about what we need to do next to achieve gender equality. One is the kind of lean-in perspective, that there's a series of things that women need to do to change how they interact with the world with more confidence and self-belief. And then there is the approach that says, look, it's not so much about women and their behaviours, it's about structures, stereotyping, how women are perceived. And, you know, women can act in a whole series of different ways, but unless we address this, we're going to get gendered outcomes. Now, I am more from that change the environment approach, but that doesn't mean that an individual woman won't get a lot out of thinking through her own lean-in approach or going on a women's empowerment program or something like that. But to show what I mean by the interplay, an Argentinian academic, Thomas Chamorro Pre-Music, has written a book about leadership, in which he's a business psychologist. He's not a gender studies scholar, but he has looked at the characteristics that are genuinely associated with good leadership outcomes, as opposed to the ones that we think are associated with good leadership outcomes. And he basically concludes that we're suckers for believing that confidence and charisma, absence of doubt, that these things are correlated with good leadership outcomes, whereas people who are prepared to nurture and rely on a team, to listen to expert advice, to second guess themselves, to have not a crippling self-doubt, but enough self-doubt to ask the next question, that these sorts of traits are better correlated with leadership outcomes. And when he digs into that, he brings to the surface studies like there was an engineering firm, male and female scientists, engineers, who were brought together routinely to talk about, you know, the really complex problems, the big, you know, scientific engineering problem solving that they had to do. And researchers tracked that the women spoke less in those meetings. And so they concluded to themselves, aha, this is a women's confidence problem. And if they lean in a bit, then it'll all be solved. But when they dug a little bit deeper, what they actually found was if a man put forward an idea that was partly right, partly wrong, the dynamic of the group was to discard the wrong bit and to build on the bit that was partly right. If a woman put forward an idea that was partly right, partly wrong, the dynamic of the group was to concentrate on the wrong bit and discard the idea. So women were being 100% rational in saying to themselves, unless I am certain I'm right, I'm not going to put my idea forward. So, you know, it just shows that there's more complexity here between lean in and the environment than just a quick once over might say. So I would say, in answer to the question, yes, there are things women can work on in terms of their own confidence, but we need to do the structural work, because the structural work will create dynamics like the one I've just described. The structural work will also tell you that managers and appointments panels, selection committees are more likely to judge a man on his potential and more likely to judge a woman on her track record. So it's not irrational for a woman to say to herself, I'm not going to go for that job unless I tick every box. Whereas a man can chance his hand because he's more likely to be assessed on his potential. So we've got to be working in both of these ways.
So interesting. And that sort of marking down of women, which you've talked about before, about whether women pay a greater price for errors. You know, so one, as you say, rational thing is to be, you know, more cautious, also to say less. But does it also put women off going for those big roles? And that's something that does come up in the book, is that when people see what women leaders are put through, it's pretty off-putting, particularly looking at social media and so on. Do you think that there is that's a big barrier, that to see the way that women are treated in public life?
Yeah, this really deeply concerns me, and it's something that Ngozi and I thought a lot about in writing the book, and personally I think a lot about as I go around the world talking in forums like this one. inevitably, because I am an advocate for gender equality, in dialogues like this, we talk about what's wrong and the barriers. And I'm really conscious that if that's all we do, the received message by women could well be, if it's going to be as hard as that, why would I do it? This is a mug's game. I'm not going to get involved. And so I think it is really important to also put the other side of the argument, which is that there is a joy in leadership, in having the power to put your values into action, in having the ability to change your community, change your nation, change your world. If Ngozi was here, she gives an example from when she was finance minister in Nigeria, when she created a program for subsistence women farmers that profoundly changed their economic circumstances. And so she puts out the challenge, who wouldn't want to be in a position where you could lift millions of women out of poverty? Who wouldn't want to have that power in their hands? And in light of that challenge, I think what we're saying to women is, go for it, absolutely go for it. But there are still these gendered barriers to overcome. So be aware of them and get ready when you are confronted with them. You've got the benefit now of having seen the experiences of other women leaders, so you don't need to be blindsided by this. You can be prepared.
And that probably takes us to this question by Claire Smith, which is how important is it for women in positions of leadership to help other women? Is there a special place in hell for women who don't help other women?
We specifically in the book look at this. The great Madeleine Albright starts saying that there's a special place in hell for women who don't support women. And we ask ourselves pretty frankly, how crowded is it going to be? Are we all going? Will we all see each other in that special place in hell? Here, to be frank, the evidence is a little bit equivocal. There was for a long period of time a kind of belief in the queen bee, because people looked at statistical runs that showed that when a corporate board got the first woman as a director, or a management team got the first woman as a senior manager, that it seemed to stop there. And so people sort of personalised that on the woman and said, look, she's got there, she likes being the only woman there, she sort of pulled up the drawbridge and she's not helping other women through. But the research tends to show that what was causing that stickiness in terms of getting the next woman and the next woman was not so much the conduct of the individual woman. It was about chairs of boards and CEOs who said to themselves, oh, that gender equality thing, we've done that now, we've got a woman, tick, let's move on, rather than doing the more profound thinking about how do we end up with equal numbers of men and women around these decision-making tables. But having said that, we do in the book confront what we refer to as the politics of scarcity, which is because women have been coming over the sweep of history from the outside into male power structures, whether that be a parliament, a cabinet, a corporate board, a judicial bench, the editorial realms of media, all of those sorts of things. Because women have been coming from the outside and still tend to be the lesser number, it can be easy for a woman who is aspiring to think to herself, look, if women routinely have a quarter of the spots or a third of the spots, my way through is to replace one of the women who's there, rather than to use the collective muscle of women with male supporters working together to break through for the profound change and to eradicate gender biases in how these groups are being brought together. So we do ask women to think about that. Now, that doesn't mean that all competition between women is bad. In my home country, in our state election last year in Queensland, a woman premier contended against a woman leader of the opposition. Obviously, the nature of democracy is one's going to win, one's going to lose, and we will see that repeated in other Australian states. That's fine. We shouldn't wish away all competition amongst women, but this faux competition where we're artificially pitted against each other while men still take the bigger share, I think we've got to be very prepared as women to come together and address that.
That's interesting. You do talk about the sort of human failings in a way of trying to change everything individually, because one point about being a leader, I guess, is that you're very busy. So you do mention mentoring, and some of you thinking, with the best will in the world, it's why it has to be distributed a bit. Not everything can hang on your shoulders. That you've got to go for the structure as well as the individual. And I've got a question here on education, which is, what are your thoughts on the role of education globally in driving gender equality in leadership?
Thank you for that question, one very close to my heart, and it's absolutely critical. I would say fair access, equal access to education for girls is a necessary but not sufficient condition for gender equality. If it was a sufficient condition, then the UK, Australia, many other countries around the world would already be, gender equal societies, because it's been quite a few years now that women have outperformed men in education, and more university graduates and the like have been women. So it's not a sufficient condition. There's always more to do, but it is a necessary condition. If you are not seeing women come through in equal numbers, then it's impossible to build a gender equal society. And in many of the places on earth where the Global Partnership for Education is at work, we are in situations where only 1 in 10 girls will come through to complete secondary school. There are still difficulties with girls in equal number to boys doing primary school every year of primary school. We are talking about hundreds of millions of children who are either locked out of education entirely, this is pre-COVID, or are in schools for such a short time or of such poor quality that they don't master the basics of literacy and numeracy. And we are desperately concerned about how these underlying inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID. At the height of the pandemic, 1.6 billion children were out of school. That happened in developing countries. It's continuing to happen in some, as they're still fighting the pandemic and don't have the same access to vaccines that a country like the UK has. And we know from earlier epidemics like Ebola, that when schools close, the risk is that the most marginalised children never get back to school when they reopen. And by the most marginalised, I disproportionately mean the girls, who are at risk of child marriage, pregnancy, being put into forms of labour, either domestic labour, subsistence agriculture and the like, and they never make a return to schooling, which is why, in terms of getting new resources and new energy into the campaign around girls' education, that this year is absolutely critical. We are at risk that the progress we've made over years now on girls' education could be stalled or lost because of the impact of COVID, unless it's all shoulders to the wheel, and with UK and Kenya in the lead. First and foremost, the UK and Kenyan shoulders are going to the wheel to try and make sure that around the world, donor nations commit to education, and developing countries also commit to maintaining or increasing their expenditure on education. So this is not a substitution, it's a genuine growth of resources.
Thank you. There's at the G7 GAC, there are 3 themes this year, which is ending violence, education, and empowerment. And what's been interesting is to see how related they are. That if children aren't safe, they won't get to school, and if they don't get to school, they're not going to get the jobs and the future. So I just wondered if there were any sort of specific barriers, because it's obviously a really big problem about girls dropping out of schools, for various reasons. And once they have, that they're in danger of, as you say, of sort of forced marriage, or of sexual violence, or of just opportunities being sort of taken away. Of what's your recommendation for just making sure that those girls are in school?
Yeah, there's no one way of doing this. I mean, obviously, schooling is very alive to culture and context, but of the things that the Global Partnership for Education has seen deliver change, in very impoverished societies, I think people say, look, it's a culture to not send girls to school, and you know, there are cultural factors at play, undoubtedly, but also poverty is at play. And if you try and imagine yourself in the circumstances of a very poor family, where the daily struggle is basically to access enough calories so everybody eats and gets to go on in the family unit, you know, families like that are confronted with very tough choices. And it may, you know, make sense in that family's world to say, well, we'll keep our girl at home. She'll do the domestic labour. That frees up the mother to do subsistence agriculture or to take goods to market. That's going to give us the best possibility of keeping, you know, everybody fed and keeping our family unit going. And so small changes to that equation can actually have profound effects. So school feeding programs, if poor families know that if their girl goes to school, she's going to get a meal in the middle of the day. And obviously with school closures, the loss of school feeding, if it's not substituted for, has a poverty impact. Very small cash transfer programs can make a difference to that equation. Work in the community by community leaders, not by outsiders, but by community leaders to explain the long-term sweep here, that an educated girl will become an economically empowered woman who is more able to contribute to the family and to her community. All of these things help bring change for girls' education. Female teachers in many societies, I'm thinking of places like Afghanistan, having schools staffed by women has changed predispositions about whether families would send their girls to school. So there's not one solution, and that's why we work in a development model where developing countries, communities are in the lead, working on the best change strategies for their community, and we are working with them rather than trying to steamroll out of, you know, London or Washington or, you know, Sydney or wherever, saying we definitely know what would work here. Of course, we marshal the evidence, but we've got to be working in cultures and contexts as we find them, and working with local leaders, with national leaders to find the best pathways through.
Thank you very much for that. Next question is, how should social welfare policies in wealthy countries seek to account for gender disparities exposed by the pandemic?
I think that there's once again, there's no one instrument here, but I think that there's a variety of things to think through. I mean, if we look at economic downturns across, you know, contemporary time, mostly economic downturns have been characterised by the loss of full-time, predominantly male jobs. And so the economic stimulus measures that have been used have been calibrated to address that kind of economic problem. This is a recession of a different nature, and at the heart of it is the loss of part-time, often female jobs in industries, you know, very consumer-facing industries are the ones that have had the maximum impacts from COVID. And so I think that is challenging policymakers to think through a different set of economic tools. Then as we come out of the health crisis into the economic crisis, I think that there are things to think through in terms of strengthening labour force participation by women. And so that brings you to social policy programs, including the provision of childcare. It brings you to social policy programs around support for families when children are very young. The evidence shows that societies that have equalised entitlements between men and women around time off and government benefits at the time of the birth of a new baby, that if you particularly make the male entitlement one that you use or lose, you can't transfer it to a female partner, that does right from the outset change norms in the family home about patterns of care for the child. that still show up to 5 years later. That's the data set that's been done to date. So I don't mean to be saying that the change patterns of care end at 5 years, but that's what we know so far. So I think if we bring a gender lens to policy instruments that will be part of the economic rebuild, then we can make a real difference building back better for gender equality.
Thank you. And this related question from Laura Wainwright is, do you think the motherhood penalty is the main reason for gender equality in the workplace?
I think it's a reason. I think it's a very significant reason. I don't feel confident to say it's the main reason, but it's certainly a very significant one. And one of the things that certainly shows on flexibilities and entitlements is if a business makes available a family-friendly package of entitlements to enable people to balance work and family life. If they are only used by women, then a career penalty is paid by the women who use them. If they are used by both men and women, then no one pays a career penalty. And I don't mean that in the superficial sense of the male leader who wanders around in the days that we worked in offices ostentatiously saying, I need to leave early because, my son or daughter is in a school play tonight, with a pitch for Dad of the Year award. But I mean in a substantive sense, which is, the likelihood of taking time off around the birth of a child, the likelihood of asking to go part-time because you're a father, the likelihood of asking for flexible work. And obviously we've all had a lesson in what flexibilities can look like in the pandemic, that those things are equalised in the workplace, then that helps overcome the motherhood penalty.
And do you think that's something that has come out of COVID, that as everyone started to think about flexibility? So in some ways we see it absolutely didn't work, that women took on the burden of domestic responsibilities, but presumably quite a lot of men also enjoyed the sense of being amongst their family. Do you think we could see any sort of change? We talk a lot about female equality, but the role of men. Do you see a change there?
Yeah, men are pivotal to this change agenda, and a gender equal world will be better for everybody, better for women and better for men. And given men still disproportionately have their hands on the levers of power, if they aren't using their power for change, then we won't see it. So we need men involved in this. And the evidence actually shows that if men are prepared to point out sexism, that their voices are listened to. They're not seen to have a conflict of interest in calling out sexism. So men can actually have a huge impact. On patterns of work, I think, to be frank, this is still to play for. I think, businesses now, civil servants, everywhere, politics, people are rethinking patterns of work given what they've learned from the pandemic. We're not going to simply snap back to a world in which, people get on planes every other day. People need to be in the office from, very early in the morning to very late at night to prove their commitment. We're not going to go back to that world. But we need to be thoughtful about how we take the best of what we're doing now with us. If we just say, people can kind of choose, I think the risk is that men disproportionately choose to go back to the office, women disproportionately choose to work from home, and or at least sections of their time. And if you don't change anything else, then I think we'll end up with a new form of presenteeism. If I'm the boss thinking about who deserves the next promotion, the man working in the office next to me is incredibly visible. I see him all the time. Gee, he's putting in a million hours, he's standing out. Whereas you, who are working from home on screen, may be busting out better outcomes, but you're less visible to me. So unless we, change merit, how promotions and training opportunities are viewed, then I think we could be baking in a new and different kind of gender inequality. So still to play for, but I am optimistic about the potentials of this.
It is interesting. It takes us back to the start of this conversation about women disappearing from public in a way. Are we going to see a sort of invisibility, both at leadership level and in offices? But it could also be something that works for women if men will be part of this. And I've got one more question, if that's okay with you, which is from Holly. Do women on the left and women on the right face different barriers to political advancement? Both of the UK's female prime ministers have been from the right.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, the data is different in Australia because I'm the only female prime minister from the Labor Party. I think that there are possibly some differences. This is really, I can't get a big data set out for you here, so I won't try and do that. I do know in Australia that the Labor Party has done a better job of nearly equalising the number of men and women in Parliament. So we've got our national Parliament, we've got our state and territory parliaments. As long ago as the early 1990s, we adopted an affirmative action rule. And if you look across parliaments now, the Labor team tends to be in the zone of half-half, maybe 55-45, but in the zone of half-half. The Conservative parties decided not to use affirmative action. They went for networking and various other models. And, they tend to sit around a quarter women. So I do think that, structural interventions like affirmative action rules can make a big difference. And in Westminster democracies, if you don't have a, starting class of women who are backbenchers and then make their way through to the ministry and then into more senior ministries, then you obviously don't have people who can be potentially considered for Prime Minister. I mean, Theresa May, for example, had served at the highest echelons of government before she became Prime Minister as Home Secretary. So I think there can be some differences in that. I think there can be some differences in media treatment. I think perhaps conservative media is more likely to go with a female conservative leader and less likely to play the gender sort of stereotypes against them. They're, sort of likely to conclude if she came through in a conservative environment, she's got what it takes. But if she came through in a progressive environment, she probably got a few concessional passes because the progressive environment is more attuned to dialogue about sexism. I think there's a little bit of that potentially in play. But, I don't have all of the answers. It'll be something to reflect on. My colleagues and I at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership are always up for a challenge, so maybe we'll have to look at this next.
It's a good question about, are they described differently? I'm trying to think if women of the left, words like bossy and nanny might occur more, whereas somehow, and on the right, certainly with Margaret Thatcher, there was the sort of weird, both half worshipping, the mummy kind of syndrome, wasn't there? Well, but there is still a case, is there not, that women that do become leaders, it's despite the odds, and I guess it's how you think overall you can change those odds.
Yes, absolutely. And and once again, there's that sort of stock flow question. I remember Margaret Thatcher getting elected. I was in my late teens, and it did help the penny drop for me that a woman could become Prime Minister, because I hadn't seen female leadership at the political level in Australia. Having said that, coming from my family background, my father was from a coal mining village in Wales. The adjectives that got used in front of the noun Thatcher are not ones that I'm going to repeat now. So we were not fans of her policies, but the role modelling effect, I think, really makes a difference. So, you've had Margaret Thatcher, you've had Theresa May, that's all to the good. But, if we were in an era of gender equality, you'd be able to look at a sweep like that from the late 1970s to where we are now, and around half the time you would have seen a woman lead.
Would you expect to see Kamala Harris as the next president of the United States?
Too early to tell, obviously. Yeah. Well, too early to tell. But one thing I think to look out for is whether a narrative around overly ambitious settles around her, which I think will be a gendered narrative. So I suspect every vice president in American history has dreamed in, you know, when they're in bed at night, they've had little dreams about being president, and everybody's thought that's fine. If she is seen to be too ambitious, too big for her boots, too concerned about whether she's going to make president, I think there will be a gendered narrative around that, that is, we mark down ambition in women, but we expect it in men.
That's interesting. And dream teams, you know, work if as long as the woman is subservient. But thank you very much indeed. It's been a fascinating hour. I've learned so much, and we'll think particularly on your thoughts on education. But generally, it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you very much for your time with Bright Blue. I hope we'll be seeing you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. A great conversation. Thank you.